Where is it that the gurus and enlightened ones get their knowledge? The knowledge they seem to glean from somewhere beyond time and space. Is it the Akashic record? That which saints and psychics the world over refer to as a continuous record of all mankind's earthly experience? A kind of cosmic computer which only a privileged few have been able to tune into? These imperishable records are said to reside in a sort of universal mind, existing somewhere beyond time and space. The American-born Edgar Cayce, world-renowned prophet and psychic of the 20th century, demonstrated his ability to read the Akashic record in over 14,500 clairvoyant readings. Cayce baffled doubters, astounded believers, and was almost always proved correct. Time after time, in his self-induced sleep state, references to Jesus of Nazareth would appear until a clear picture of the lost years emerged. Documented in Edgar Cayce's story of Jesus, the following information was revealed about Jesus' education. In a trance state, Cayce said, "The periods of study in Palestine were only at the time of his sojourn in the temple, or in Jerusalem during those periods when he was quoted by Luke as being among the rabbi, or teachers. His studies in India, Persia, and Egypt covered much greater periods, that there might be completed the more perfect knowledge of the material related to those cleansings of the body in preparation for strength of the physical, as well as in the mental man." In India today, it is possible to observe these practices. Cleansing is not only a physical act, but a purification of the thoughts, words, and actions of the individual. The goal is oneness, the merging of the purified individual with God. It is salvation, union, yoga. Cleansing of thought is attained by focusing the attention on a chosen aspect of God. When, through this practice of concentration, the individual transcends the sense of self and merges with the object of attention, it becomes meditation. The continued practice of meditation and prayer frees the mind of external influences and desires and allows it to perceive its divine inner nature. Cleansing the mind permits the body to function free of stress and dis-ease. The body can then manifest its energy in the form of strength, endurance, and abilities we term miraculous. The creative energy of life is perceived as residing within each individual, coiled as a serpent at the base of the spine, from where it will rise and travel along a path, activating 7 centers of energy called chakras. These centers are survival, reproduction, power, universal love, creativity, awareness, self-realization. There is one law at the base of this philosophy. We recognize it as Newton's law of physics, which says, "For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction." In the East, this is called the law of karma, and is the foundation of religious as well as scientific thought. Is it possible that Western science, the golden rule of Christianity, and the first law of Eastern philosophy are presenting the same message? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because for each action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In her book, Edgar Cayce on Jesus and His Church, Anne Reed quotes from Cayce's clairvoyant readings. Jesus and John were in Heliopolis, Egypt, for the periods of attaining to the priesthood or the taking of examinations, passing the tests there. According to Cayce, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built to be the hall of the initiates, or that's sometimes referred to as the White Brotherhood. In that same pyramid, did the great initiate, the Master Jesus, take those last of the Brotherhood degrees referred to in the Gospel as 3 days and nights in the tomb. The Master passed his initiation, releasing his soul from bondage to the material world and death. At another time, Cayce was asked, "What is the significance and meaning of the words Jesus and Christ?" He replied, "Jesus is the man, the activity, the mind. the relationships he bore to others. He was loving. He was kind. He was gentle. He grew faint. He grew weak, and yet gained the strength which he had promised in becoming the Christ by fulfilling and overcoming the world. Ye are made strong in body, in mind, in soul and purpose, by that power in Christ. The power, then, is in the Christ. The pattern is in Jesus. We have come to know about Jesus from his teachings, from his followers, and from those who have a special ability to probe the universal mind. But is it possible that Jesus himself left a tangible message we are just now learning to understand? The Tibetan legend ended with the crucifixion. But the Gospel of St. Luke continues the story. Now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid him in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever yet been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices which they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. In the excitement and wonder that followed as they ran to look for their risen Savior, something was left behind. The shroud which had covered the body while it lay in the tomb. Today, almost 2,000 years later, it is believed by popes and by scientists that the shroud that covered the body of Jesus not only has survived, but has preserved for us an accurate image of the physical likeness of Jesus. Is this the face of Jesus? In a recent book about the Shroud of Turin, Robert Wilcox interviewed Ralph Graeber, a nuclear scientist, who has been involved in the research which produced space-age computers for modern missiles. Graeber's scientific expertise has brought added dimensions to his study of the shroud.
Yes, it sounds impossible, but the Shroud of Turin actually does provide people of our generation with a true photograph of Jesus Christ. Let me explain. Here we have a photograph of the shroud. It's a long cloth, about 14 feet 3 inches long and 3.5 feet wide. And here we can see where a human body laid on the cloth. Here we see the back of the head, the shoulders, the back area, the legs, and the feet. And then the cloth wrapped around the top of the head. And here we see the image of the face, the chest, the crossed arms, the nail wound in the hands, the spear wound in the side, the legs, and the feet. This face image is very detailed and was probably formed when intense radiations of life energy from the body of Jesus caused a change in the molecular structure of the linen cloth and caused a darkening. And we can see at the tip of the nose, where the cloth laid closest to the skin, the image is darkest. This kind of image is known as a photographic negative, and this gives us an actual photograph of Jesus that is 2,000 years older than the invention of our cameras. It should also be kept in mind that only this image, this photographic negative of Jesus, was available to painters and sculptors until the invention of the camera. Then, in 1898, this primitive camera was used to make the first photograph of the shroud. and as the photographer was developing the negative plate, this is what appeared to his eyes. We see here that the white cloth is now in negative, or black, but the facial image is positive, with lights and shadows in proper arrangement. Thus, people of our century have something quite new, this actual photograph of the face of Jesus.
The first historical reference to the shroud is found in the Gospels. Little is known of its whereabouts during the early centuries. This was a time of persecution of Christians, so it is understandable that such a precious relic would have been kept safely hidden away. But at some point, it was moved from Jerusalem to Constantinople, where records indicate it was seen in 436 AD, when the Empress Pulcharia, a granddaughter of Emperor Constantine, built the Basilica of St. Mary to house the shroud and to display it to the public every Friday. A current theory suggests that the image on the shroud was the inspiration for early Byzantine depictions of Jesus. The actual shroud was again reported seen in Constantinople in 1150 AD and later in 1201 AD. In 1204, Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders, and the shroud was taken as part of the spoils of war. It is believed to have been carried north to Vienna and then west to France. About 150 years later, in 1355, it was displayed to the public in Liry, France. In 1389, a controversy arose in which it was charged that the image had been painted on the shroud. Many believed the charge at the time. However, it was later proved impossible for the marks on the fabric to have been caused by any form of paint or pigment. In 1452, the shroud was taken to Chambéry in southern France and presented to the Duke of Savoy, a member of the powerful family which would later come to rule all of Italy. At Chambéry, the shroud was kept folded in a silver chest. On the night of December 3rd, 1532, a fire engulfed the palace. So great was the heat that the silver chest began to melt, and drops of molten silver fell onto the folded cloth, burning a pattern of holes in the shroud. As it was pulled from the fire, water further stained the fabric. The Carmelite nuns repaired the holes with fresh altar linen and lined the shroud with white velvet. They also marveled at the fact that although marks damaged both sides of the shroud, the image of the body was left untouched. By 1578, the owners of the shroud had become the royal family of Italy. It was then that they arranged to move this most precious possession across the Alps to a new cathedral in Turin, the capital of their realm. The Cathedral of Turin, with the Chapel of the Holy Shroud, was built near the end of the 15th century. The lower dome is above the main altar of the cathedral. The higher dome is over the altar in the Chapel of the Holy Shroud. This dome is over 200 feet high. Because of the danger of fire which had threatened the shroud, the chapel and altar were built entirely of marble. The actual shroud is rolled around a cylinder, which is sealed before being placed in the silver reliquary, which is then put inside a heavy iron box and placed behind a double iron grillwork. With the exception of the years during World War II, when it was moved to southern Italy for safety, the shroud has remained here in Turin. The shroud was first photographed in 1898 by Secundo Pia using this camera. The event attracted the attention of the French Academy of Sciences in Paris. The speculation was that this was the world's oldest photograph and certainly worthy of scientific study. The examination was undertaken by a senior member of the Academy, Dr. Delage. Preliminary studies were focused on the authenticity of the shroud as shown by evidence carried on the fabric itself, and upon the phenomena that it might possibly be the world's oldest photograph. In 1902, Dr. Delage presented findings to a packed meeting of the prestigious French Academy of Sciences. His evidence for authenticity was sound and was not challenged. 30 years later, Pope Pius XI, who was a scientist as well as Pope, said, "We speak now as a scientist, not as Pope. We have personally investigated the shroud, and we are convinced of its authenticity." The shroud is still owned by the Savoy family, although they no longer rule Italy. In 1933, the Italian courts declared the shroud to be the personal property of the royal family in order to protect it from Mussolini. The shroud is exhibited to the public on rare occasions. In 1898, in honor of the wedding of King Victor Emmanuel III. In 1931, in honor of the wedding of Umberto II. And in 1933, to commemorate the 1900th anniversary of the death of Jesus. It now takes the permission of the ex-King of Italy, the Cardinal of Turin, and the Pope to publicly display the shroud. It has been seen as recently as 1973 and 1978. Since the Middle Ages, popes have spoken of the shroud. Recently, Pope Paul VI called it the most important relic in the history of Christianity, and Pope John XXIII said, "This can only be the Lord's own doing." Many questions about the shroud are now being answered with scientific techniques of the 20th century. One of the first questions invariably raised is whether or not a skillful artist in the 14th century could have painted the image we see. The study of this question has brought three conclusions. First, the fabric of the shroud is woven linen in a 3-to-1 twill weave with a herringbone pattern throughout. This type of weave has been found in fabrics from the Middle East which have been dated from 100 to 300 AD, and this weave was unknown in France in the 14th century. Secondly, art historians point to the fact that the style of art of the 14th century was so different from the realism and anatomical precision portrayed on the shroud that it is inconceivable that it was produced at that time. The conclusive finding on this theory is that there is no evidence of paint, of brushstrokes, or of pigment of any kind on the fabric itself. Dr. Max Frey, the noted Swiss criminologist, has scientifically time-dated the cloth in an unusual way. Authorities have so far been unwilling to cut the cloth to provide samples for carbon-14 dating. So Dr. Frey took pollen scrapings from the shroud and subjected them to criminological analysis. These tests revealed the presence of pollen fossils that could only have come from plants that grew exclusively in Palestine at the time of Jesus. He also found pollen samples that helped to trace the travels of the shroud. This is based on the presence of pollen fossils which date from the time of the Crusades and came from areas of Turkey. Still other fossils date from France of the Middle Ages. The major unresolved question is, just how was the delicately detailed image of the body formed on the cloth? Biologist Dr. Paul Vignon and physicist René Colson developed the vapor graph theory. They speculated that the perspiration from the body had reacted with the spices packed around it to form a gas, which then rose and stained the cloth. The gas would have had to travel in a perfectly straight line, both up and down. While experiments have succeeded in staining fabric, the kind of precise detail of the shroud has never been recreated. Another popular theory involved heat radiating from the body and scorching an image on the cloth. This heat is thought to have occurred during the miraculous conditions of the resurrection, when the body dissolved in a blaze of light. This picture shows some experiments carried out in England. This small brass medallion was heated, and a linen handkerchief was laid over it. The handkerchief was scorched with a negative image, and when the image was photographed, it produced a corresponding positive image. But this image is very crude and does not contain the kind of detail found on the shroud?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, no one has succeeded in reproducing fine details in a laboratory picture, but we do have some pretty good clues. These images are the closest approximation we know of to the shroud images. A Dr. Volkringer at the French Academy of Sciences found that these herbal leaves that were discovered by chance after they had been pressed between the pages of a medical textbook for 100 years had formed an image, not on the page next to the leaf, but several pages away. The image Dr. Volkringer found is the one shown here, which is a negative image of the original leaf. Here we see that when these images are reversed with a camera, we have positive images comparable to the shroud images. It seems reasonable to postulate that some type of life energy was radiating in both cases, with the major difference being that the leaves radiated at a low intensity for 100 years to accomplish what the body of Jesus, radiating at a very high intensity, accomplished in the few hours in the tomb. So, pursuing this line of research, the next question is, what other evidence exists for radiation of this type from physical bodies? In recent years, we have seen development of a science known as Kirlian photography, which is providing much new understanding of life energy radiations. In this picture, we see how Kirlian photography shows us the energy patterns that exist around a rather ordinary geranium leaf. And here we see similar radiations from a human hand. Many people think that what we are seeing here is some portion, or technically some bandwidth, of the human aura or halo. Kirlian photography as a science is still in its infancy, but it is now beginning to give us pictures of energy fields not tightly locked to matter. In this photo, the tip of the leaf has been cut off, but something remains there and has given a normal appearance to the energy flares. And another experiment with cut leaves gave this remarkable photograph. In the area where the leaf has been cut away, we see a pattern of energy that closely matches the physical matter that has been removed. This could be what is called the astral body of a man, the body of energy that permeates and activates the physical body and is related to the phenomena of auras and halos.
Could this be an actual photograph of a halo? Christian saints and angels, as well as Jesus himself, have traditionally been portrayed with a golden circle of light around the head. Do these halos represent an unseen presence projected by the godly? Or is it an emanation that was once seen by men and portrayed in art that is too subtle for our eyes?
Our science has now developed to the point where matter and energy are seen as two sides of the same coin, the same substance with taking on two different manifestations. We have come to see the human body not as solid, but as a collection of spinning electrons, protons, and atoms, and these combined into a variety of forms to give us blood, bone, flesh, and tissue for the human body. In the purest philosophy of the East, all matter is seen as a form of consciousness, and as such can be affected positively or negatively by consciousness. Simply expressed, it is mind over matter. Is there a measurable difference between bodies with differing levels of consciousness? This picture compares the intensity of one type of radiation, aura radiation, from the body of an ordinary man with that of a man who has dedicated his life to spiritual practices and meditation. What the Bible calls the single eye, and Eastern philosophy calls the third eye, enables some individuals to perceive the auras of people around them. This picture lets the rest of us see what they see, that the aura of an ordinary man extends some 2 to 3 feet from the body, while the aura of a saint extends 20 or 30 feet, giving it an intensity at the body surface of maybe 100 times that of a man whose consciousness is blocked by ego, illness, and other human limitations. If we believe that Jesus' consciousness was free of limitations, either because he had cleansed his mind, mastered his body, and released the life force of his chakras, or if we believe that Jesus was free of limitations because he was the Son of God, in either case, it follows that the radiation intensity from his body would have been very great. For some, this theory goes a long way toward explaining the body images left on the burial shroud. It also explains why no other shroud images have been found in the centuries following the death of Jesus.
It is apparent that understanding the surface radiations from the body will be one more step in unfolding the mysteries of the shroud and of man. But one question remains. Did the energy force that created the image on the shroud leave any other sign of its power? The Gospel of St. John. It was the day of preparation. In order to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not a bone of him shall be broken. The Roman centurion who thrust the spear was named Gaius Cassius. The spear he carried that day came to be called the Spear of Longinus, and for 19 centuries it has been the center of an astounding historical odyssey. A legend arose which attributed tremendous power for good or for evil to whoever possessed it. Is it possible that by merely touching the body of Jesus, an iron spear could have been infused with such power? From the study of the shroud, it is apparent that the spear entered the body between the fourth and fifth rib and was in position to puncture the heart. The outpouring of blood described in the Bible indicates the heart was punctured. The spear was also in position to puncture the heart chakra, that vortex of spiritual energy which is believed in the East to be the center of divine, selfless love, the very quality that Jesus embodied in his life. One theory attributes the emanations on the shroud and the legendary power of the spear to the life force radiations generated by the chakras of the enlightened Jesus, the power of the spear being so much stronger because it contacted the heart chakra directly, while the shroud was only affected by emanations through the body. What is of interest to us is the effect the spear has had on powerful men through the ages, men who believed the legend, who believed it had pierced the heart of Jesus. By 285 AD, the spear was in the possession of Mauritius, the commander of the Theban legion. He was put to death by the Roman tyrant Maximian for refusing to worship the pagan gods of Rome. His soldiers chose to die with their leader rather than worship the Roman gods in whom they no longer believed. Every 10th soldier was decapitated. Over 6,000 legionnaires died. In the 3rd century, Constantine the Great announced he was guided by providence as he held the spear during the historic battle on the Mulvian Bridge. It was this battle which gave Constantine control of the Roman Empire and made it possible for him to declare Christianity its official religion. When it came time to build his capital of Constantinople, Constantine held the spear before him as he paced off the boundaries of his new city. The Spear of Longinus passed from one ruler to another, sometimes by conquest, sometimes by inheritance. Men such as Theodosius, who subdued the Goths in 385 AD, Alaric the Bold, the savage who converted to Christianity after he sacked Rome in 410, Theodoric the Visigoth, who fought the barbarians and stopped the onslaught of Attila the Hun, Emperor Justinian, whose ambition was to reunite the old Roman Empire and end the division of the Eastern and Western churches. By the 8th century, the Arabs had invaded much of France. Europe was saved from total domination by the general Karl Martel, known as the Hammer, who held the spear of Longinus in his hand. For Charlemagne, the spear represented the blood of Christ and was the central force in his life. He kept the sword by his side even as he slept. Charlemagne fought 47 battles, convinced that the Holy Spear made his armies invincible. For 1,000 years, from the time of Charlemagne to the end of the 18th century, 45 Germanic emperors carried the spear. One day in 1909, 20-year-old Adolf Hitler was inside the Habsburg treasure house at Vienna when he overheard a guide describing the legend of the spear. He later wrote about that moment. At first, I didn't even bother to listen to what this expert had to say about it, and then I heard the words which were to change my whole life. The guide said, "There is a legend associated with this spear that whoever claims it and solves its secrets holds the destiny of the world in his hands for good or evil." Hitler stood transfixed as the guide told of the legend which said this was the spear that had pierced the side of Jesus. The spear was in 2 sections, joined by a gold band. The blade was wrapped in strands of copper, silver, and gold, which held in place a nail believed to have come from the cross. The guide further explained that Napoleon had demanded the spear after the Battle of Austerlitz. At that time, it had been smuggled out of Germany and taken to Vienna for safekeeping. When Hitler first saw the spear, it was a part of a collection of Austrian royal possessions on display in the Habsburg treasure house. The fact that the treasure had fallen into Austrian hands in an attempt to keep it from Napoleon, and then was never returned, added fuel to Hitler's fiery determination to one day see Austria under German domination. Hitler later said, "I knew with immediacy that this was an important moment in my life." Adolf Hitler was not the only man in Germany to be fascinated by the legend. Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the notorious SS troops during the Third Reich, was so intrigued by the spear that he had an exact copy made for himself. Himmler used slave laborers under the whips of his SS troops to rebuild an ancient castle to house his replica. The castle was the infamous Wewelsburg. Wewelsburg was built as a shrine to the spear and to those Germanic rulers of the Holy Roman Empire who had possessed it. It was used by Himmler for top-level gatherings of his SS officers. The officers were assigned to a different suite of rooms on each visit. Himmler's plan was to infuse the spirit of each of the dead rulers into his men. He had the rooms decorated in the period and style of the various emperors. There were rooms for Otto the Great, Henry the Lion, Frederick Hohenstaufen, Philip of Swabia, Conrad IV, and others. 2 of the rooms were always reserved. Himmler's room was dedicated to the memory of Henry I, called the Birdcatcher because of his interest in hunting. Henry I had defended Germany against the Slavs and Magyars in 933. He so impressed Himmler that each year on the anniversary of his death, Himmler and a group of SS officers kept a midnight watch over his grave at the Quedlinburg Cathedral. It was in his room that Himmler kept the replica of the spear. The final suite of rooms was created for the sole use of the Führer. It was dedicated to the Germanic ruler admired most by Hitler, the ruler who held the spear as he knelt to be crowned by Pope Hadrian IV, the ruler whose name became the code word for the Nazi invasion of Russia, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. The Nazi invasion of Austria was completed in 2 days. 29 years had passed between the time young Hitler first stood before the spear and as the Führer entered Vienna on March 14, 1938. It is not possible for us to know his true thoughts as he returned in triumph to the city where he had lived as an outcast. But we do know he immediately went to the Hofburg and took possession of the crown jewels and the spear.
Eine kühne und stolze Mission. Wenn Berlin Hauptstadt des Reiches ist, Hamburg und Bremen, die Hauptstädte der deutschen Seefahrt, Leipzig und Köln, Hauptstädte des deutschen Handels, Essen und Chemnitz, Hauptstädte der deutschen Industrie, dann soll München wieder werden, Hauptstadt der deutschen Kunst.
Hitler spent only one day in Vienna. Late that night, he entered the Habsburg treasure house. He remained alone with the crown jewels and the spear for over an hour. At last, they belonged to him. A national holiday was declared in honor of the return to the fatherland of the symbols of the ancient German rulers. An armored train carried the regalia from Vienna to Nuremberg. The famous Meistersinger Hall of St. Catherine's Church was chosen by Hitler to house the treasure. Throughout the early years of the war, the thousands who came to pay homage to the objects saw the spear of Longinus at the center of the display. Nuremberg had been industrialized by the Nazis, and so it was a target for Allied bombers. The first raid on the city did extensive damage to the area near the church, even destroying the roof. The spear was moved to a bank on the corner of Königstrasse. As it became clear that the Nazi armies were not invincible, Hitler ordered a permanent hiding place built for the spear. A medieval tunnel beneath the Nuremberg fortress was chosen. It was here that the regalia had been hidden before being taken to Vienna in 1806 to avoid Napoleon's grasp. Hitler ordered a vault prepared in the tunnel, and when it was ready, the treasure was moved from the bank. Instead of taking it out of the city as announced, the regalia was delivered secretly to a house that now served as a front for the entrance to the tunnel. On October 13, 1944, an Allied air raid destroyed the entrance to the tunnel and exposed the massive iron doors of the secret passage. The entrance was again camouflaged, the treasure ordered moved. By a fateful mistake, the wrong spear was taken, and, with the other important pieces of the regalia, hidden in another deeper tunnel, leaving the spear of Longinus behind. The battle for Nuremberg began on April 16, 1945, and ended 4 days later on April 20th. While Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in Berlin, the United States Army marched into Nuremberg. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was intent on locating the symbols of Germanic rule in order to prevent them from becoming the rallying point of a resistance movement. 10 days had passed since the fall of Nuremberg without a trace of the regalia. Then, on the afternoon of April 30th, a small group of American GIs discovered the secret passage and the spear. Within the same hour that possession of the spear passed out of German hands, hundreds of miles away in Berlin, as Russian tanks approached, Adolf Hitler killed himself. The spear was now in the hands of the United States. General George Patton was the only official to identify it and understand its significance. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied armies in Europe, gave the order to return the spear along with the other treasures to Austria. This was done on January 4th, 1946. The spear of Longinus and the shroud of Turin present clues to a timeless mystery. Are the answers in the future, or have they been with us since the beginning? The concept of messiahs, Christs, and avatars can be found running like a golden thread through all the world's faith and scriptures. The dictionary defines an avatar as the descent of a deity to earth and his incarnation in a human being. In India, where the concept is probably most familiar, a full avatar is known to possess 16 qualities: control over the 5 physical aspects of the body, control over the 5 senses of the body, and control over the 5 elements of nature. Various of these 15 aspects can and have been acquired by yogis and saints through austerities and disciplines. For example, research into the biofeedback phenomena has led scientists to yogis who can alter their rate of respiration and heartbeat, change their body temperature at will, and can withstand wounds to the body without pain. The 16th and final aspect of a full avatar is the divine quality of omniscience, an inborn quality inherent in the descent of an avatar. According to the Bhagavad Gita, whenever the world is passing through a spiritual and moral crisis, an avatar comes in order to uphold righteousness and to reveal the next evolutionary step in creation. Lord Krishna was the last such avatar to come to India. Today, in south-central India, there exists a man of miracles, a saint who is said to possess all the powers of an avatar, a man whom many believe to actually be the reincarnation of Lord Krishna. His name is Satya Sai Baba. Most of the miracles attributed to Jesus Christ have reportedly been duplicated by Sai Baba. His followers believe him to be beyond time and space. Free from the laws of physics, Baba is said to be able to read minds, to see into the past and future, to transport himself anywhere in the world instantaneously, to be in more than one place at the same time. There is virtually no illness which he is not reputed to have cured, and there is even evidence that he has brought a devotee back from death. Sai Baba's fame has been growing throughout India. The English-language newspaper Blitz, published in Bombay with a circulation in the millions, reported that Swamiji's ashram, Prashanti Nilayam, is fast assuming the status and symbol of a Hindu Vatican. The staid London Times hails Sai Baba as, quote, the most impressive holy man in centuries. P.J. Karanjia of Blitz reported, as I watched him going around the devotees, materializing vibhuti, sacred ash, for the needful, he seemed to be there and not there at the same moment. Sometimes he would appear to be talking or singing to himself. At others, waving his hand, palm upward in the air, in rhythmic mudras, as it were. The impact between the devotees and their Bhagawan was immediate, electric, powerful. It was like the point-counterpoint between musical instruments or melodies whose vibrations inspire newer and ever newer notes till they merge in divinity. Being an avatar of Baba's magnitude, one who is able to transcend time, it is not unusual to hear him talk firsthand of Krishna, Rama, and other great saints, including Jesus. Dr. Jack Hislop, president of the Satya Sai Baba Society of America, translates what Sai Baba had to say on one occasion about Jesus Christ.
I was with Swami when a question was asked about the early life of Jesus, because there had been so many rumors that Jesus spent some time in India as a young man. And Swami replied, yes, that Jesus did spend time in India, that he arrived in India at about the age 16. He traveled through India and parts of Tibet and parts of what is now Persia, that sometimes he wore a sort of a dhoti garment, a wrap, that sometimes people took him for just a traveling yogi. Because of serious hardships when he was very young. He had acquired the habit of having only one meal a day throughout his life. That was his custom. And then Swami said that at about age 25, Jesus realized that he was Christ.
At all times, Jesus Christ had a mind which was pure and which was unwavering and selfless. All the work he did was dedicated to the good of the world. In the early days, he used to proclaim himself as the messenger of God and would say that he has come to serve all the peoples of the world. While calling himself the messenger of God, he conducted himself as the servant of the people, and for 12 years he was often found in meditation. As a result of his meditation, he proclaimed himself as the Son of God. He was moving closer to God. He spent 5 years in the Himalayan regions of India. After coming to India and practicing spiritual disciplines, he proclaimed that I and my Father are one. After experiencing this identity with the Father and proclaiming himself one identical with the Father, he then returned to his own country.
The concept of the fatherhood of God did not originate with Christ as is generally assumed, for the Aryans of India addressed God as the Father, as did the Greeks. Christ taught, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Vedanta says, having realized him by means of meditation, with a pure mind and sincere heart, the wise will never meet with death. Christ taught, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." The Vedas say, "Thou art that." Christ taught, "Do unto others what ye would have others do unto you." Buddha says, "With pure thoughts and fullness of love, I will do toward others what I do for myself." In effect, the basic teachings of Christ, the Buddha, and the Vedas are the same. The name Jesus Christ connotes two different ideas: Jesus the man, the human being with his given name, and Christ the anointed, the God that is in all men. When one studies the Hindu scriptures and Buddha's teachings and sees that these sublime truths are in harmony with the teachings of Jesus, it is not hard to believe that Jesus did go to India and other lands of the East in preparation for his mission, which ended physically on Calvary, but spiritually will never end until the entire human race shall know the universality of the truths he died for.